So you want to start a podcast. That's great. Here's what not to do. Even though I've never had one on this channel specifically, back in 2019 and a little bit of 2020, I was a part of a podcast. I produced and edited a podcast that was kind of like ran in my family. It was posted on YouTube, Spotify, a whole bunch of places. It ran for about a year. That year was quite a bit of fun. I had never really worked as a part of a team before making online content, for a while. I got to grow as an editor. I got to, use a multicam setup, edited audio, edited video, had a lot of creativity there, got some experience with social media marketing.
Well, what's going to happen is ICE is going to break down the freaking door in like 30 seconds.
Yes.
And just come in and just rip you up.
FBI, open up!
It was a great experience all around, but it failed. It failed because over the course of that year, a lot of things weren't being done as they should have been done. We were missing out on a lot of opportunities, doing a lot of things wrong, and either people weren't noticing it or people weren't, speaking up and pointing it out. Our growth had plateaued and the ship was sinking, so eventually the podcast was called off. We did have something unique about ourselves. I just think that we didn't go in the right directions. We didn't do the right things. And that's why today I'm gonna teach all of you how to do the right things. Learn from my mistakes. Learn from our mistakes of, why we didn't make it and why we didn't grow. So take my advice. I have a lot of talking points I wanna go over. This is how you podcast correctly. Right off the bat, most importantly, you wanna podcast with like-minded people. What do I mean by this? I mean, when you're making a podcast, let's say you're making a sports podcast. If you're making a sports podcast, don't bring on someone that wants to work on a political podcast and another person who wants to work on a gaming podcast. You want to bring people onto your team that want to work on your idea. It's almost better to podcast by yourself at first and just make quality content by yourself and maybe bring people on that can edit and stuff like that. A big problem with our podcast is a lot of different people wanted different things, wanted to be making different content, and that led to some unhappiness. And you don't want that in your podcast. You want everyone to be wanting to work on a certain type of content. You want everyone to agree on what content you can make. Therefore, you can not focus on people being unhappy with the content. You could focus on making that content as good as you possibly can. Secondly, you want to have weekly meetings with your team to discuss, your shows and your content for the next episode. But these meetings, make sure that they're productive. Make sure that everybody is bringing opinions forward and everybody's talking, If you want to even do like a passing of the torch where everyone starts the meeting with 5 minutes, you can lay it out, however you want to lay it out. But essentially, you want to be using these meetings to talk about what can be improved upon in your previous episode, what was done well in your previous episode, stuff like that. There's a lot of things that meetings can be used for. They shouldn't be used for just, BSing and hanging out the whole time. My third little tip is that have a niche with your show. Just find a niche that you can target where it's easier to grow an audience with a niche. Personally, our podcast was an everything show. And the problem with everything shows is that, one, when somebody asks you about your podcast, you can't really answer anything about it. So a lot of people would say, oh, what is your podcast about? And I'd be like, because I couldn't answer. I didn't really have anything that I could brand or podcast about. It was more of like, we were marketing our personalities instead of our content, I think was what we were trying to do. And the problem with that is if you're already a celebrity, it's great. But if you're like us, and most of us, have never really worked on YouTube content or podcast content before, nobody knows who we are. So marketing your personality when you're like an unknown startup podcast is not really gonna work too well. Not only is there the problem of like pitching your podcast to people, the problem is if you don't have a niche, it's just harder to grow an audience because there's so many everything podcasts out there. And I call them everything podcasts is because you cover everything. People go to podcasts to listen to a certain kind of content. Like they go to a true crime podcast to learn about true crime, sports podcast to learn about sports. Maybe there's like an astronomy podcast. People go to podcasts for a specific niche most of the time. Bottom line, have a niche, Have something where you can like have consistent content about a similar topic every week. Don't be an everything show. My fourth tip is this. Don't be stuck in the temporary. Always bring quality. And this is kind of like, okay, that's phrase kind of weird, but a lot of times, like I saw that we did this. It wasn't like an intentional thing we wanted to do, but we would get like a temporary design or a temporary this or a temporary that for the show, and then never upgrade from that temporary thing. If you're making like a temporary logo or a temporary, you know, profile banner or channel banner, make sure that not only does it still look good, make sure that you improve on it in the future. Don't have the temporary become the permanent. You know, you should always be trying to improve the look of your podcast, the designs in your podcast. Everything should always be improving. This is a very fast-paced world, the entertainment world, and if you don't improve, you're gonna fall behind. Tip number 5 is something that kind of like ties into my last tip, and that's always be evolving. You know, always be able to be critical of your own content. And this is not something that applies to just podcasting. This is content in general. Entertainment and content production is very fast-paced. If you don't keep evolving quick enough, you will fall behind. Now, don't get me wrong. Don't just go around saying, oh, my show sucks. Like, no. If you see something in your show that you genuinely think is good, go by the motto, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. But if there's something that you think you know you can do better about your show, try and do it better. You know, be able to look at other shows and be like, okay, what makes this show successful and how can I do it better than that other show? Or if not better, at least as good as other shows, you know? Don't steal things from other shows, but like take inspiration from other popular podcasts that, you know, you think that you're able to replicate some of the things that they do successfully. Most of the time when your podcast is plateauing, you know, it's because you haven't changed anything in terms of the quality of the show. And that's kind of something that we struggle with because, you know, since our podcast wasn't growing, we couldn't really invest in like the quality of gear. What we could have improved on is kind of the quality of our content, refining our content, seeing how we can make the content more engaging to audiences, how we could draw people in to stay longer and get our average watch time up. Okay, this next piece of advice is so important. Prepare your content. It's so important that you at least have an outline of what you want to discuss in the show, because audiences can pick up when you're just rambling, and when you're just rambling, audiences not only pick that up, but then they realize there's no point to the episode, and if there's no point to the episode, why should they watch it? Why should somebody put the time in to watch your hour-long episode when they can tell that you're just rambling for an hour? There's no meaningful content or meaningful preparation that went into your show. You have to prepare something, some sort of topic, some sort of talking point that can help guide you through the show. You want your show's structure to be good. I think our average watch time, I did the math, our average watch time for any of our episodes was around, I think, maybe 7 minutes, and our episodes were an hour and 20 minutes long. Therefore, if our average watch time is 7 minutes, my line of thinking was we should be getting in to our main segment within 7 minutes. Make sure your intros of your show aren't too long. These are things that get ironed out in preparation, in the outline, you know, of your episode. This is why it's so important to prepare. Now, my last 3 tips are things that are kind of obvious, but I have to include them anyways. Number 7, invest in like decent equipment. Obviously, have the equipment for a podcast before you start the podcast. One of the things that I actually pride our podcast on, my podcast that I was a part of having, is we had a pretty good setup. We had good microphones, our audio quality was pretty freaking good. Like, I would listen to the audio quality on like a car, like through a car aux and everything, or like even just on my phone, and I'd be like, wow, this sounds kind of good. Like, so what would happen is like, as the sign it was like, you know, put in, you'd hear bang, 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 and then the battery would be like, okay, off speed pitch. We had a pretty good thing going with the audio. Now, obviously, you know, quality of like equipment and quality of audio and video is one thing. Quality of content is another thing. And I do think in terms of quality of content, we were average. I think we were probably average. And I think that was our big problem. It's more important to have quality of content versus quality of equipment and quality of production. Make sure that your audio quality, if you have video with your podcast, make sure your video quality is at least decent. At least it's average. Make sure that it's, doable, that someone can listen to it without wanting to scratch their ears out. My second to last piece of advice is this: always be an attentive host. Now, in my podcast, we had never hosted a show before. We were noobs, podcast noobs. It wasn't the best display, and it shouldn't have been the best display of podcasting. We were doing it for fun. It was a creative outlet. It was a hobby. We took it seriously, but we were new to this. And so we were gonna just have to learn by trial and error. And I think a lot of times what happened was we got so engrossed in having fun with our episodes. I'm guilty of this too. We would kind of lose the sharpness in being able to realize what we were doing on the show. I almost kind of forgot that it was a podcast, and that can be good and bad. It's good because if you forget it's a podcast, the nerves go away. But it's bad because if you forget that you're doing a podcast, you start to forget some of the essential things you need to be doing as a host to keep the content, engaging and good. I think something that everybody had a problem with my show was talking over each other.
Dugout phone. Well, the Yankees were accused of that too, I think, at one point.
So that's that triangle I'm talking about, where it's just
the Yankees were accused of, misusing it.
We would talk over each other a lot, interrupting, not letting people finish talking points. Sometimes 3 people, even all of us would be talking at the same time. Having my headphones on, I actually had to take them off at points. It was pretty bad. Listening in live during the podcast, because we had our headphones running through something where we could get live feedback. I had to take my headphones off. It was too much. I got overwhelmed. So if you're getting overwhelmed during your show, think about how the audience feels. Hello, and welcome to my podcast. Hope you're having a great day today. Today, we're going to be talking about the mysteries and wonders of space. You definitely want to be the former as opposed to the latter. So as an attentive host, think about, okay, have I interrupted anybody? Has somebody brought up a point 2 minutes ago that they, didn't get to finish? Should we go back to that? Are we getting too off track? Have I talked over people? Is there too many people talking over each other? Do I need to take a step back right now and let somebody else finish their talking point? Do I gotta write something down on a piece of paper so I don't forget it? Is the content getting too boring? Do we need to move on to something else? These are things you should constantly be thinking about while you're doing your podcast. Think about how you can steer the content in the right direction. Think about, is the content good while you're making it? And that's your job as a host. And lastly, be original. This is so important because there's thousands of podcasts out there nowadays. All of them, are basically probably going to be doing the same thing that you're doing. And originality is so important. If you can find a unique angle or take on a certain genre, that's gonna, oh my gosh, you're gonna be so much more marketable. And think about what those thousands of podcasts are doing. Most of those podcasts are just, a bunch of friends get together, they buy a few mics, they set them up, they have a few drinks, and they just, drink and have fun and talk about whatever. If you're doing that, you're gonna be lost in the sea of podcasts, you know what I mean? If you want growth, you need to be better than that. You need to be taking any unique take that you can on a specific niche that you wanna go into. I'll give you an example. Our most successful episode, the one that actually grew naturally, got us only 200 or 300 views, but that was our highest viewed video for a while. Was we did an interview with a prison guard from Rikers Island back when Rikers Island was at its most dangerous. This guard had some crazy stories to talk about on our podcast. And to hear those stories, you had to come to our podcast. That was a unique angle or a unique take that we had. And that's why it was one of our best episodes, because the content, that was some of our best content we had ever made during our show. But there you have it. Those are 9 things you want to make sure that you don't mess up when doing your podcasts. Now, don't get me wrong, some of these mistakes were more critical than others, you know, in kind of like the disbanding of, you know, my podcast, the one that I used to work on. Some of them weren't that big of a deal. Some of them were more present. But these are certainly things you need to watch out for if you want your podcast to grow. Do not make the same mistakes that I did, okay? I hope this video helped you learn. You got some takeaways from this. If you want to see more, make sure to keep updated with the channel. If you want to ask me questions live and on the fly, I am always live at twitch.tv/ExcaliburGames. I play strategy games, and right now I'm playing through Persona 5. But I'm also down to answer questions as well that you might have regarding one of my videos, so be sure to head there. And as always, I will see y'all next time. Have a great one, everybody. Bye-bye.